Okay. Thank you very much for gathering today. And we'd like to spend about 45 minutes really to talk about the global phenomena of a startup ecosystem, literally worldwide. And without further ado, let us start our conversation. We don't have any presentation. We like to have a conversation among three of us. So with that, but I think it's a good idea for us to start introducing ourselves, and perhaps starting from Marc.
Yeah. Thank you, Hiro. My name is Marc Penzel, one of the founders of Startup Genome, and we started actually as a research organization trying to understand what makes startups and startup ecosystems successful. You'll see us publish a lot of reports, but we then started advising governments around the world, across 60 countries to date, and helping them take better decisions on policy and program investments. And now for the last couple of years, we're also working directly with startup entrepreneurs and scale-ups, helping them with global commercialization.
Well, Michael.
Hi, my name is Michael. I was a deep tech entrepreneur in the US. I did a spin out of Princeton, exited that, worked in BC and Silicon Valley, then made the jump across the Atlantic where I do growth stage investments in deep tech in Europe. I invest typically between 10 to 20 million checks into Series B, Series C deep tech companies. I also sit on the boards of various family offices, private banks, and endowments, on the advisory board for deep tech for University of Oxford, and on boards of lots of different deep tech funds across the world.
Excellent. And so briefly about myself, I'm Nishiguchi, Hiro Nishiguchi. I advise large organizations to become more innovative by introducing innovation management system, but also we work with the startups to go global. And so with that capacity, so we have a very data-driven researcher and also advisor, and also actual deep tech investor. Both of you have tremendous experience in the history behind you. So with that, let me ask the first question. How was the startup ecosystem in Europe 20 years ago?
Pretty non-existent. So I made the jump across the Atlantic in 2008. It was right during the financial crisis. There was, going from sort of the West Coast US to Europe, there was the deep tech, just in general, the startup ecosystem in Europe was negligible. There'd only been a few success stories. At that point in time, you had Skype, you had a couple of other companies, but it was still very much early days. Everybody, there'd been a slight boom sort of during the dot-com bubble where you had, Benchmark Europe, which ended up becoming Balderton. They opened an office there. Excel opened an office in London. But when you got to places like London, Berlin, Paris, the ecosystems were pretty non-existent. There have been a few minor ecosystems in some of the universities covering spin-outs, but honestly, I can tell you stories about, when I first moved over, everybody I knew in the Valley was just like, you're fucking crazy. Europe is dead. There's just no tech ecosystem there. They're never going to be successful. All the good entrepreneurs come over to the US. And that's changed. Now, if you look at Europe, the ecosystem's developed quite rapidly. Benchmark is, if you look at Sequoia's opened an office in London, Lightspeed's opened an office in London. I think Europe is very much so on the global landscape, and the amount of venture capital going into Europe has elevated quite rapidly.
Well, thank you very much for your experiences. Marc, what's your view?
I'd like
again,
to put
startup ecosystem 20 years ago in Europe.
I'd like to put my data hat on again, and when we started Startup Genome around 12 years ago, what we found is that the value that's been created in the global startup ecosystem at around 80% was concentrated in 4 cities around the world, or 4 regional hubs. And ever since, what we've been seeing is that this concentration has gotten less and less and less, right? And in Europe, it's a great example because with Berlin, with London, with Copenhagen, Stockholm, so many different cities that have come up that are now able to produce not only startups, but also scale-ups and to a great extent also unicorns, even if that's not the most important thing to track. But we're really seeing that more of these places are actually capable of participating in the startup ecosystem and in the new economy, which is fascinating and exciting for us to see.
Well, it sounds like a great journey, basically around the globe, particularly in Europe, and for the past 20 years. So with that, where are we right now? Let's talk about today's ecosystem. Okay, now we have our data. Why don't you, Marc, explain the methodology behind this and about 6 indicators, etc. this is very rich data, so why don't you start talking about it, please?
Yeah, just to give you a little bit of context of how we put together our model 10 years ago. Actually, we surveyed around 100,000 entrepreneurs around the world and really tried to get a better sense of their experience building companies in each of these communities around the world. And then based on these findings, based on these insights, we've been working with experts around the world to put together a framework that is actually capturing to a great extent, of course it's not perfect science, but capturing to a great extent the experience and the important elements of each of these entrepreneurs and ecosystems around the world. And we're looking at the performance of an ecosystem, as we call it, and this is basically the size and the quality of a startup community. How many startups do you have? How many of them are actually producing $50 million, $100 million plus scale-ups? We're looking at the access and the quality of venture funding that is available in an ecosystem, of course, very important to measure, also because there's a rich data set that we can work with. Connectedness, we find that entrepreneurs that are better connected to their local community and to their global community tend to grow their revenues faster than those that are basically working on the companies by themselves, so to speak. And we're also looking at access to international markets, very important point that we'll be discussing more. Plus also the knowledge in terms of institutions of higher education, research institutes, etc., that are available in the innovation community for the entrepreneurs to collaborate with. And then the last element is, to what extent do we have, as an entrepreneur, access to quality talent that we can work with, and also to what extent, is some of these talent and some of these entrepreneurs experienced in building startups, because that experience, tends to be very important on this journey. And what we see here, just to give you a bit of an overview of the methodology, but what we see here is that, of course, North America still dominates the global startup ecosystem, but we mentioned that there is a shift taking place. Tokyo right now in our 23 ranking came in at 15th in the world, and you see that many of the other Asian ecosystems and European ecosystems are starting to play in the top 20.
Okay, we often talk about Silicon Valley, but now we can see New York City, London, Los Angeles, and Boston, Beijing, Singapore, these so many cities. And based on your deep tech investors' experience, what is really happening as of today in terms of various diversity of ecosystems?
I mean, Silicon Valley is still clearly the overall number one by a wide margin. You can just see whether it's AI, whether it's Risk5, and also I think what's interesting in Silicon Valley is it's really three ecosystems, right? You have the actual Silicon Valley, you have San Francisco, and you have the East Bay, which is sort of the Berkeley area where you're getting a lot of Risk5 technologies. And that's still, Silicon Valley, if you want to meet the ecosystems of the world, you go to Silicon Valley because you can find great entrepreneurs from pretty much every country in the world still congregating there. From a deep tech perspective, I mean, London's quite interesting just because you have the triangle area with Oxford and Cambridge. There's just a tremendous amount of IP coming out of that region. Los Angeles is actually, for hardware, becoming a very interesting ecosystem, particularly around El Segundo, where you have a lot of people who worked at Tesla coming out. They're starting hardware companies. You have Anduril, which is based in that area in Southern California. And I think you're getting, particularly on the engineered technology, a tremendous amount of startups. Tel Aviv also, always a fantastic ecosystem where they create just really good, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's a whole host of different technologies, and then they quickly get those companies to the US. Because I think what's kind of marked about a lot of these other ecosystems is they're very light on liquidity, so they're not actually having exits. So oftentimes in order to have the exits, you have to get your company to North America. So if you're looking at sort of Europe as an example, by the time you're a deep tech company in Series B in Europe, most of your customer base and most of your investment money is going to be coming from North America anyways. So in order to get liquidity, and that's the biggest issue in venture capital in Europe is there's no exits. The DPI and the funds are quite minimal. So they'll have really nice on-paper markups, but when it comes to actually having return on investments, for most of these other ecosystems, I think that's where they lag behind quite substantially.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So let us kind of zoom in what's going on in Tokyo, and by comparing other big cities such as New York, London, and Singapore, and also Silicon Valley as well. Okay, Marc, why don't you walk us through this chart, because this is a very interesting chart to look at.
So
we
as you-
can talk hours on this, but
Yeah.
limit yourself, please.
Exactly. So these are again the Global Startup Ecosystem Report factor scores that you can see, and we have Singapore, Tokyo, Silicon Valley, London, and New York City on the spider chart. And what you can see is that Silicon Valley, to Michael's point, is great across the board, right? All of the things that you need in an ecosystem, you find them in Silicon Valley, of course. The same is true for most of these places. However, what we find for Tokyo, while there is an abundance of great talent, while there is tremendous amounts of knowledge in the traditional innovation ecosystem at the universities, the corporate fabric, etc., one key challenge that we identified for the ecosystem that has also been a resounding element in all of our conversations in the last couple of months is the capability and perhaps also the willingness for Tokyo-based entrepreneurs to take the leap and access international markets, right? And this is definitely something that I think we would like to discuss here because we see it as a critical element, as a critical challenge for us to solve in order to really push Tokyo's performance and ranking further up.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talked about Europe a few minutes ago. What is happening in terms of like a globalization or internationalization of European startups? Do they want to stay in their country, or do they want to go out? What's their fundamental thinking process?
No, so the younger generation of entrepreneurs goes international quite immediately. And if you're a European, a young European, right? So a European under the age of 40, odds are you're bilingual in English, you've studied abroad, whether abroad within different European countries. Because I think a lot of people kind of map Europe out as sort of one ecosystem where it's actually multiple ecosystems. And they also all, especially younger entrepreneurs, have the ambition of going to the US where they can be a global champion. And I think that's something that's going to happen in Japan as well. There's an opaqueness to the market in Japan, which I think is some of that's cultural. There's language barriers, et cetera. But if you're an international investor trying to access the Japanese market, there's a lot of barriers, right? There's not a lot of information on the Japanese tech ecosystem in English. Even if if you look on PitchBook and all sorts of platforms that investors use, there's just not a lot of richness of data from the Japanese market. And I think that's something that's going to fundamentally have to change, just because Japan as a home market is just not substantial enough to grow rapidly to be an international sort of category leader in any sort of tech vertical. So I think that's something that's going to have to change. I think that's, and overwhelmingly from the conversations I've been having here over the last few days since I got into town with Japanese entrepreneurs and Japanese investors, is that's sort of the big barrier right now, is that the Japanese ecosystem is very Japanese. And I think that's something that's going to have to fundamentally change in order for there to be real growth, because talent pool is fantastic in Japan, but no country has a talent pool that's big enough or good enough to kind of exist without foreign intervention, foreign talent coming in. And right now in the 21st century, we're living in the new arms race is for brains. So it's whichever country can kind of aggregate the most brain power is going to be the one who builds the best ecosystem and ultimately just grows their GDP and has substantial amount of technological growth is what you need in the 21st century.
Any comments?
Maybe I could quickly add to that, because it's also about the cross-pollination of the talents in each of these ecosystems, right? I mean, I'm not sure how many of you were able to attend other international conferences, but it's really, really important typically that we meet with and engage with other entrepreneurs, investors, in order to understand what is the latest and greatest in my specific vertical. What are some of the hacks in which I can perhaps solve the problem that I'm currently facing? I like to think of the global startup ecosystem as an informal knowledge network almost, where you need access to these other brilliant minds in order for you to do a better job at scaling your business. And as I said earlier, we see it in the data. Those people that are connected are actually building better businesses. So it's not only an element of attracting the talent from international ecosystems in order to stay competitive in building the technologies, but also to just understand what is happening, what companies are built outside of Japan, and how can we stay competitive in adapting accordingly, basically.
It sounds like more we know about the entire ecosystem, the more successful we can be. Yeah. Even when we are actually focusing on the Japanese market, being part of this knowledge network, the global knowledge network, is a big plus for any startups. Is your message?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. So let's this chart is very interesting because, in fact, there are many similarities between New York, London, and Tokyo, and also there are some gaps between them. And so we talked about the importance of the market reach or internationalization, but the word of internationalization has many meanings. It has a much nuance in it, and also there must be some stages or phases. Yeah. So I'd like to actually take let's take maybe use like a case study or even like an example from Europe, like France or UK startups. From their perspective, what was their journey to internationalize, to go international or to global for startups? Maybe your invest portfolio or for both of you. Yeah, maybe Mike, you can start.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's coming from different directions. So coming from banging my drum on deep tech. So from a deep tech investment perspective, there's a large arbitrage opportunity in Europe to invest early into European deep tech companies. Keep the science and research in Europe because the science and research talent is as good as in the US, and it's also much cheaper. And it can also, because of the way the European system is set up, they can also get that heavily subsidized. But then move the front office to North America, where obviously most of their sales will be coming from. And so I can think of a French medical device company I invested in that has made this move. So they moved their headquarters, they're the CEO, the head of sales, head of talent have all moved to Boston, which is sort of it's the epicenter for sort of biotech, medtech in the world. And just that move of moving their company from Europe to the US, they estimated increased their valuation by 3x just by simply moving headquarters. And their company's now gone on to raise over 400 million. And so one of the interesting things is when I was talking, I had caught up with the COO recently, and he was telling me that when they were based in Europe, they were hearing from an institutional investor or a bank probably once a week. Because obviously if you're in a medical device company, you've raised over 400 million, you're clearly going to be exiting whether through an IPO or some sort of large liquidity event. So from a bank perspective, you're going to be very interested in that company. Now that they've moved to Boston, they're hearing from somebody every day. So it's just a difference in magnitude of just how more elevated that ecosystem is compared to Europe. So that's one example. Lots of other examples where you have young entrepreneurs who went over to Silicon Valley, worked at a Facebook or Google, whatever, learns those best practices, and then moved back to Europe, are now building really interesting companies. So this whole kind of fact of internationalization, it's not always about just bringing international talent, but it's also exposing the local ecosystem, the local talent pool, the best practices abroad. And also building that network, because if you're a Japanese entrepreneur, eventually you're going to want to tap into ecosystems, whether they be in the rest of Asia, North America, or Europe. And so if you have people within your network that you can contact in those other countries, that's just going to be a huge value add for you as an operator as you're trying to expand your business.
There seems, I think it sounds like there might be several layers of knowledge and expertise network globally. Yeah. Like an entry point, like a midpoint, even like an expertise point. Like there must be several layers of knowledge and expertise network. And maybe can you make a comment from that angle, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're interested in a career in tech or becoming an entrepreneur yourself, that international experience is relevant throughout each of the different stages of your life and your career, so to speak, right? I mean, as a university student, being exposed to startups in one of the top ecosystems just opens your mind typically around the opportunities of perhaps taking a leap of faith, working on something that has a big mission, and really, be part of the global startup community the way I see it. And then when you think of, early stage companies, for these guys, it's very important, very relevant to attend some of these conferences, for them to build connections, at each of these events and ecosystems. But when we think of later stage, Series A, B, C, D, none of these guys, you see them attend these conferences and meet a lot of new people. At this point, it's really more about how can I build my customer and my investor network in relevant markets, right? And this is an important distinction that we're trying to make with our government clients as well, that these Series A, B, C companies, they need support as well in building their B2B corporate network in target markets, because they, maybe they've been working on their company for the last couple of years, but they focused on their business model and the way to build their team, etc. They didn't necessarily have the time to build their their network of potential customers as much. So are there any ways that we can also support these later stage companies in gaining international traction is some of the things that we're working on.
I think it's also important to remember that different ecosystems, it's almost, you might disagree, but it's almost like a sort of a football analogy where there's like the Premier League and then there's kind of different leagues underneath it. And Silicon Valley is still the Premier League, right? So if you, as an entrepreneur, if you have the opportunity to go spend a few months there, you will have a learning experience that you're just not going to get locally. Other nice thing is now Silicon Valley is also a bit of a state of mind, where because of things like social media, the internet, blogs, all this fun stuff, is you can access a lot of this talent and a lot of this sort of expertise just through going online. And you saw that a lot in Europe about 10, 15 years ago when sort of Twitter took off and you had different blog posts. So people started reading, European entrepreneurs started reading what Fred Wilson was saying, what Brad Feld was saying, what different entrepreneurs were saying. And so even if they couldn't physically be in the US, they could at least get exposure to sort of those best practices, which as an entrepreneur, if you're coming from an ecosystem that might be a bit more conservative, a bit less developed, that allows you to push back against maybe bad terms that investors are offering or a term sheet that's just inexcusable. And so you understand that, oh, hey, wait, I don't have to say yes to this, or I don't have to accept the way it is. You can actually see this is the way it's supposed to be, and you can sort of push that in your local ecosystem. And I think that's also incredibly important, and it lifts all the other sort of ecosystems up, and you've just seen, at least in Europe and also in sort of secondary ecosystems in North America, you've seen the quality, the bar just go up because they can access all this information now. Yeah. So definitely, like as an entrepreneur, you should be constantly curious. So go out there and try to find the best information you can.
I mean, Michael's basically describing my personal experience. I mean, I grew up in Germany, and we're in many ways very similar to Japan, I think. I mean, culturally, we're typically more conservative. Most of the people tend to go for a corporate career, etc. At least that was the case 10, 20 years ago. And then I got this opportunity to move to Silicon Valley, and I lived there for 5, 6 years to build my business. And it completely changed the way I approach my career, my business world, etc. And I hired a couple of people to join my company from Germany. They now moved back to Germany and start their own startup. So it's really, that cross-pollination that we mentioned. Yeah. Silicon Valley still is one of the most critical nexus of knowledge as far as this, knowledge exchange and mindset development is concerned. I would agree.
It's not like a circulation of talent, knowledge that going on globally.
Yeah.
Not necessarily within a region or even between cities. It's a global circulation of knowledge and talent. Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Well, let's talk a little bit more about internationalization, because I think we have conducted. By the way, Startup Genome is a very data-driven company, and based upon our data-driven research, I think maybe it's our time to talk about this chart. So, Mark.
Yeah, actually, I haven't shown this to Michael, but we were serving 34,000 companies and following their trajectory, their progress over 3-4 years. And then we were looking at, okay, how many of these companies actually become $50 million plus, $100 million plus companies? And what are some of the common behaviors, some of the decisions that each of these companies have made? And of course, correlation is not causation, but still it was interesting for us to see that, the average scale-up rate for these 34,000 companies was 4.6%. We had 34 unicorns that participated as well. And all of these companies that were doing tremendously well and scaling fast, they were typically giving stock options to all of their employees. And to me, intuitively, it makes sense, because really you want to build a community around your mission and make sure that people come along, they believe in it, they work hard, even if you're unable to pay big salaries, especially in the first couple of years. We find that, again, I mentioned this 2 times already, but we found that those people that have the connections to Silicon Valley, to London, to New York, they tend to perform better. And then the third point, which is perhaps relevant to you, Michael, as well, is that those companies that actually engage advisors and perhaps also offer them a minor equity share in the business, people that are perhaps 10, 20 years more experienced, have made some of the mistakes that you want to avoid as a first-time entrepreneur, especially. these are some of the very practical ways you can really maximize your chances of success. And it was amazing to see it in the data. So I just wanted to bring that as, some of the very practical decisions that founders have made to make or to increase the odds of building a successful business.
Thank you. Any comments or reaction, Michael?
No, I think you see this. I think advisors with equity. I think you see this a lot. Look, if you're starting your entrepreneurial journey, particularly as a younger entrepreneur, first-time entrepreneur, there's a lot of people who've already gone through it, right? There's already people who've been there, done that, and if you can have access to that knowledge, fantastic, right? So part of it is you do have to network. You do have to not be afraid to ask questions, ask people for help. The worst you're going to get is a no, and a no really, it's not going to really do any harm to you. I would say that the caveats to these things is don't give up too much equity. I have seen startups bring in founders with 5% equity to advisors and things like that. That's absurd. Like, make sure if you're giving out equity, it doesn't need to be a lot. It's just enough to keep people interested. Yeah. So there's always some caveats to that. Stock options, that's a big issue in a lot of emerging ecosystems and developing ecosystems. A lot of the times the founders just don't leave enough stock options open to their employees, and that's a great way to entice people to come on board, right? Because you're selling, especially as an entrepreneur, you have to sell a vision, you have to sell a journey, you have to convince people to do something that might not be the most logical choice, being joining your startup. So you're going to have to give them a carrot, and the carrot is often stock options.
Excellent. Well, we touched on some let's talk about people, particularly from a career perspective. I understand that Europe, generally speaking, European countries tend to have a little bit conservative culture, social culture, compared with that of America. And you were saying that Europe and Japan have some similarities in terms of younger generations used to be similar in terms of younger generations, career, aspiration, etc. So why don't you talk about the changing pattern of younger generation in France or Germany in terms of the first choice of employer?
Yeah, I can jump out of this. I remember, this must have been like 2008. I was at a fundraising dinner in Paris. This was like my first or second month in Paris. I got sat next to a CEO of a CAC company, so the big publicly listed French company. I got sat next to the CEO at this fundraising dinner. We started talking, and he's like, "Do you know how you get ahead in Europe?" I was like, "No, how do you get ahead in Europe?" He's like, "You study really hard to get into a really elite school. You go to a big name company, you keep your head down for 20 years, and eventually you get ahead." I was so amazingly depressed by that comment, because it was very much so the opposite of what you kind of learn in sort of the West Coast and East Coast in the US. But it was very much of the mentality in Europe, right? If you were French, you went to work for Total or L'Oreal. If you were German, you went to work for Siemens or Bosch, and you had like a really nice, comfortable lifestyle, right? That was very much so how the post-war economies of Europe were set up. I think fast forward now, because of internationalization, because these younger generation can see the successes of the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Elon Musk, et cetera, the younger generation wants to be entrepreneurs. So if you're going to engineering schools or business schools in Europe now, one of the top paths of a career is going to work in tech and to be an entrepreneur, right? I mean, it's kind of surreal. You have, masters in entrepreneurship, which I think is an oxymoron. I don't know why somebody would study or get a degree in entrepreneurship, but it's a very popular degree. I mean, learning entrepreneurship from an academic just seems awful. I don't know how politically correct we have to be here, but it sounds like, learning how to be good in bed by reading a book. It's just not going to work. Anyway, fast forward to sort of now, you do have entrepreneurship and tech is seen as a very legitimate career path. And I think it's something that eventually I think is probably starting now. So I'm talking to some young entrepreneur from Japan, some new graduates, and it's now seen as a career path. So it just seems like that is also now occurring here, maybe 10 years after Europe, but it is occurring. So I think it's a positive thing.
Yeah, I think the change is already happening in Japan, but looks like the change we are seeing in Japan did happen already in Europe, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Yeah, and I think that was sort of the general, so that was kind of like the business school engineering students, and now you're seeing it kind of approached in the scientific community. So I invested in a fusion technology company in Germany, and the two PhDs who started the company both European, but they did their postdoc at MIT, and they said that was the best thing ever because if you're studying in the sciences in Europe, they still don't talk about entrepreneurship. They don't talk about business. Science is considered like a dirty word, business in sort of the science STEM community. But they said when they went to MIT to do their postdoc, like everybody in their lab was working on a startup, had done a startup, and it was just kind of an eye-opening experience. And so I think now, at least from the deep tech side, it's now becoming a path for scientists and researchers in Europe. So I think that's kind of the last hurdle to get over before you're going to start seeing a kind of a boom in, hopefully, more STEM entrepreneurship in Europe as well.
Any comment, Mark?
Yeah, I think, I'm just reflecting on our experience back in Berlin at the time, around 12 years ago. I mean, we started having our first few big startup success stories in Berlin. And in addition to the Mark Zuckerbergs, et cetera, that we've all read about, heard about, I think it made a fundamental difference that we've also seen that these people can build successful businesses in our home city, in our home country. And then, I mean, many of the people that were interested were joining these companies and gaining that hyper-growth scaling experience and kind of learning the trades of how you build a business, how do you enter an international market very rapidly and try to capture as much market share as possible very quickly, how to play the venture game, etc. And you see these with these mafias, as we call them sometimes, right? The Skype mafia and the Revolut mafia, like some of these big tech success stories in Europe, they actually build an ecosystem around them where many of the former employees then start their own venture, start their own journey because they came up with a brilliant idea, you know, at a conversation with one of their peers, colleagues, or friends, and it's really part of an exciting movement that success and exits beget success and exits continuously in each of these places, you know.
And I think that's why it typically takes about 20 years to build an ecosystem, just because you have to have role models. You have to be able to see people locally who've gone out there, who've been successful at being an entrepreneur, who have had a bit of liquidity in the fact that they can go back, they can angel invest. You have employees who now they've vested, they have some liquidity, they can invest in their friends' companies, they can invest in coworkers' companies as they kind of spin out, or they can go and be entrepreneurs themselves. And so it takes time. You're not going to build an ecosystem overnight.
Yeah, I'd like to mark your words. So it takes 20 years to build an ecosystem. Okay. What do you think, Mark?
I mean, we're seeing that in the data, right? I mean, all of these places that we're discussing that are now in the top 20 of the world, they've all come a long way in building their startup ecosystem. They all had these Cambrian moments where first 1 or 2 or 3 success stories emerged, where lots of talent got excited and then built their own journey, where, you know, the wealth that was made from these first big exits was recycled into the ecosystem. And it's important to recognize that, right? You need to be patient and persistent as a community to work towards, you know, really something great. And I wouldn't get too caught up with short-term, you know, perhaps failures or drops in the rankings, etc., because you're trying to build a very complex system with lots of idiosyncrasies, etc. And it takes perhaps a road with many different curves, but at the end you're driving in the right direction, and it just takes time for you to get to the destiny that you want to be at.
I guess you know, London might be a good example for us to talk about. How was startup ecosystem in London 10 years ago? Not 20, but 10 years ago. And you know some story.
Yeah, I think we started to see what we were discussing for some of the other European ecosystems, right? There started to be a bit of a movement around creating startups, etc. But still the ecosystem really hasn't come together in a way that all the pieces were there. And we're now in the last couple of years seeing that partly due to proactive policies that the government enacted around making, you know, angel investments more attractive, but also really just, you know, having entrepreneurs have a seat at the table when we talk about important policy changes, regulatory changes, etc. But also just the visibility that Prime Minister Cameron at the time gave to the entrepreneurs and the success stories, similar to Prime Minister Kishida here. I think all of these things have to come together in order for an ecosystem to take off, and this is what we've experienced in London, where they're now actually attracting some of the top funds from the US to actually open up an office in London, where we're now starting to see many more Series C, D, E rounds, big exits, etc. So Yeah, the London journey is a fascinating one, and I think it's relevant also because it's partly really designed with intent and through smart and coordinated policy actions.
I see. So they had a very strategic thinking
Yeah.
regarding the maturity
Yeah.
steps.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So based on this discussion regarding the Europe, American ecosystem, and also partially about Japan, so what is your latest assessment or even impression about Japan? Let's say from potential perspective or challenges perspective. Maybe Mark, you first, then.
Yes, I mean we're doing this assessment every year, and as I said, I wouldn't get too caught up in annual shifts, but we're seeing that Tokyo is really moving into a positive direction and continuing to produce more startups, more scale-ups, more value, more investments that is attracted, etc. And I would basically leave a note of optimism and confidence that you have amazing potential in the ecosystem, and we're now, especially for the last perhaps 2-3 years, we're seeing that more of this potential is actually unlocked, activated, utilized, and value is created. So I'm seeing a really bright future for the ecosystem if we all continue to work together as government, as entrepreneurs, as investors in building a globally connected ecosystem here in Tokyo.
Globally connected ecosystem, not standalone one.
Yeah.
Okay. Michael, any comments?
Yeah, so I think if you're looking at sort of the Japanese ecosystem, my gut impression is it seems about where sort of London was about 10 years ago. I do think there's a lot of really fantastic building blocks. So I think it's important that you're seeing this kind of shift in where sort of the global technology focus is going away from sort of internet and startups or internet and software to more deep tech technologies. And I think that's a positive thing for Japan. Japan has fantastic science, fantastic research. It's going to have to unlock a bit how to actually translate that into commercially viable businesses, which is not always easy, but it's something that can be done. And I think that with this industrial base and history of manufacturing expertise that Japan has, I think it's solidly positioned to sort of catch this wave of sort of deep tech interest that's happening. I also think something important is I think the Japanese need to be a bit more positive. So the last couple of days we've had just lots of interviews with, I've been interviewed by a bunch of Japanese journalists and talking with young Japanese entrepreneurs, and I think there's just far too much pessimism in the market. I think the Japanese have a lot to be proud of, right? They have a fantastic history, lots of innovation and inventions that have come out of Japan. And I think a lot of particularly younger generation of Japanese just don't appreciate that. And I think if you're an entrepreneur, right, you're building the future. You're turning something from nothing, and you have to be optimistic. You have to believe that the future is much brighter. And for me, that's one of the kind of the big shifts that's going to happen is you're going to have to just see a bit more. I don't know. You got to be a bit more optimistic, a bit more kind of step in it, because I just, some of the younger Japanese I've talked to are just. Granted, there's been maybe 2 lost decades or something, but that's the past. You got to get over it. You got to build a better future. So I think the Tokyo ecosystem, the Japanese ecosystem, very well positioned in deep tech. So just get on with it.
Okay, great. So I guess to unlock our potential, we have to be more optimistic and also confident in ourselves, believing in ourselves. In Japan.
Yeah, I mean, Japan's still the 4th largest economy on the planet. I mean, there's just a lot of really positive things about this country, and I think it's good for people to remember that.
Okay. And if anything, if I can add to that, I mean, I mentioned the similarities between Germans and Japanese people, and if anything that we can learn from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley mindset is like, let's have a can-do attitude. Let's also be kind of positive about our innovation and be proud of what we're building, etc. Right? I think Japanese entrepreneurs, the way I see it, they undersell the amazing technology they're building. And in some of the other markets, perhaps especially in North America, it's the other way around. So perhaps you have a bit less sophisticated technology, but really good salespeople and sales skills. So if we can learn a little bit from that and we can bridge, or put together the amazing technology and the amazing innovation that we have here with a little bit of a sales spirit and mindset that we can actually excite more people internationally to participate in our journey, I think that would actually be an important element here.
Excellent. By the way, talking about actually the ranking analysis or even insights, you have some plan, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, so we just wanted to mention that on June 10th, we will be releasing our annual Global Startup Ecosystem Report. Again, we'll be looking at 300 startup communities and metro areas, including Tokyo. And the report is available online to be downloaded for free. So if any of you are interested in the global tectonic shifts of entrepreneurial innovation, please feel free to download the study and let us know what you think.
Well, I know you can't tell the content of the upcoming report. Where are we going down, or are we going to stay, or are we going a little bit up? I mean, if you can, maybe can you tell us a little bit indication where we are going to be?
If we don't tell my team that I'm going to say what I'm going to say right now, I mean, we're seeing that Tokyo is on an upward trajectory in the 24 report, and I think people here will be very happy with the results.
Okay, thank you. And if they'd like to join us in London, of course you can fly to London. So it's going to be on June 10th.
Yeah.
Okay, as part of the London Tech Week. Yeah, Mark and I will be also there, so we would like to have a good party together. And by the way, Michael, you'll be speaking next week at Vivatech in Paris, right?
I speak at a lot of events. That'll be another one, yeah.
Okay, good. And finally, so let us finish our conversation with a few suggestions or insights from both of you regarding, again, what Tokyo or Japan should be doing, and also what any recommendation from your side.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, in the last couple of years, I think we focused too much on Silicon Valley, or we focused on one or two other ecosystems around the world. I think what we're trying to bring to communities everywhere with the Global Startup Ecosystem Report and this report, which is looking at ecosystems at the national level, is that there are many small things that we can learn from all of the different places that are building thriving ecosystems right now, right? When we think of regulation, when we think of international market access, when we think of, entrepreneurial connections between hubs. I invite you to look at these studies and interesting elements that we dig up from each of these places in order to see that there are so many things that we can learn from so many places around the world, not only Silicon Valley, London, and a select few, but there are great policies, great programs, great entrepreneurial innovations happening in over 180 countries in the world. So I hope the studies can be useful in learning more about what is happening.
And we are working with the G20, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this report is going to be a national report that we publish together with the G20 engagement group Startup 20 in order to really bring more data and more relevant insights to the policy discussions at the national level at the G20 summit.
Okay. Thank you. And by the way, the Global Entrepreneurship Network, GEN, and the Startup Genome are co-publishing this report.
Exactly.
And by the way, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, GEN has our own session at this stage. So why don't you come back to our stage with GEN and for tomorrow? And so as Michael, so your final words to the audience.
My final words to sort of Japanese entrepreneurs: be ambitious, be enthusiastic, be positive. There's a lot of positive things happening in this ecosystem, so just keep going with it.
Keep going.
Keep going. That's what you have to do as an entrepreneur. You have to get up every day, and it's not always great, but you have to keep going and love it.
Thank you. Well, we cannot keep going in this session anymore, but entrepreneurship ecosystem should just keep going, and we should really work for it. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Mark and Michael.